Sorry We're Closed is the fourth significant indie survival horror title to release in 2024, and the sixth 2024 survival horror release I've played overall. It's testament to the current genre revival that we not only have so many great games coming out in one year, but that they all have such unique identities. Sorry We're Closed is a pastiche of elements that really shouldn't work together. Part survival horror, part dating sim, part arcade shooter, but which creates something greater than the sum of their parts to explore the nature of love and loneliness in a story that is clever, funny, disturbing, and unapologetically queer. I was hoping to be able to play this game and get a review out for the day of release, but unfortunately, my schedule didn't allow for that. Still, thanks to the developers for providing the game code, but as with all my reviews, what follows are my own honest thoughts on what I played. This is the debut game from A Mode Games, which comprises just 2 developers. There's something about teams of 2 in survival horror. Yuri and Babs of Rose Engine, creators of Signalis, Tom and Adam of SFB Games, creators of Crow Country, and now CB and Tom. I don't know what it is exactly. Perhaps the closeness of the collaboration and the unity of vision that such a small team necessitates. Whatever it is, so far it seems a recipe for great stuff. There's a lot I want to talk about with this game, but let's start with the story. You play as Michelle, a young woman who is still pining for her ex and living a fairly insular lifestyle, hardly venturing anywhere else than her workplace and her home, much to the despair of her friends. When a demon called the Duchess interrupts her sleep to place a curse on her. Simply put, if she doesn't learn to love the Duchess within a matter of days, then she will spend eternity being tortured and suffering. Neither fate, of course, appeals much, and she endeavours to break the curse. As part of her new condition, Michelle attains a third eye, which allows her to see the things which most mere mortals cannot. The true nature of demons, angels, and the supernatural. This leads to the revelation that her best friend Robin is a demon, and that her other friends also have associations of various kinds with the paranormal. The game is structured in such a way that the survival horror gameplay, with exploration, finding keys, solving puzzles, and fighting enemies, is contained in specific levels that form the bulk of the game. But in between, you get the chance to explore Michelle's neighbourhood, interact with the various community members, human and otherwise, and take decisions that affect the direction of their lives as well as the story overall. This in particular means steering the direction of relationships between 3 couples, all dealing with some form of obstacle that you can either exacerbate or help them overcome, and your own interactions with the Duchess. How you choose alters their fates, affects your relationship with other characters who also have a vested interest, and plays into what ending you get. This is the dating sim aspect of the gameplay, and it's something that really shouldn't fit in a survival horror game. But the tone, aesthetic, and subject of the story all make it work. Because Sorry We're Closed isn't just about Michelle trying to lift a curse. It's about the transformative nature of love, and how it changes those caught up in it, for good or ill depending on the circumstances, as well as the world around them. And by engaging with the love lives of others, as well as by trying to infect your own situation, that is exactly what you are doing. It fits perfectly, thematically, and is incredibly engaging thanks to the writing and the feeling throughout that your choices do genuinely matter and have an impact. Something even games solely about choice-based outcomes often struggle with. There is plenty of humour and flavour to all of these interactions too, so that even one-note NPCs in the background stand out as a parody of overly trendy bohemians or other archetypes you might find lurking in the establishments you visit, while more important characters have something to like about them, even when they're complete arseholes, and are so greater than whatever predicament you must solve or worsen for them. Through the main levels, you find yourself pursuing the Duchess's former victims, each of them a viciously on-the-nose satire of some form of privilege. Yet even they have some tragedy or mistreatment underpinning their awful behaviour. And all of this speaks to the kind of story that Sorry We're Closed tells. The game is tongue-in-cheek throughout, never taking itself too seriously, and always seeing the absurdity of the set pieces we engage with. Yet those set pieces are still fundamentally horrific, and the more we see, the more the dark humour feels like both a coping mechanism for, and a byproduct of, the trauma that this situation should produce. In this context, the unapologetic queerness of the setting feels even more fitting. In its own right, especially in the current climate of culture wars and outrage bait, where the mere existence of a single LGBTQ+ character or the option to choose your own pronouns is enough to condemn a game as irredeemably woke. It's refreshing that this game is entirely set within the community and treats this as normal, with no need for greater explanation. Queer communities exist, and the game feels no need to justify that. Instead, simply placing us in that environment and telling a story about demons and the overlap between love, loneliness, and mortal peril. But coming back to the idea of humour as a mask for horror, this overlap is something that queer people have experienced without the existence of demons and third eyes. And so, just as all the best horror draws from real-world anxieties to tell its tales, a lot of the tensions and obstacles the community, individuals, and couples face feels authentic, even when told through the lens of, for example, an angel struggling with his self-loathing for loving a demon, or a demon who can't bear the thought of freedom from their eternal tormentor. Beyond the story, the presentation of this game is fantastic overall. The art style and low poly graphics scream PlayStation 1, but in hot pink. The sound design makes especially the survival horror levels feel alive in the most skin-crawling way. And even if the tone overall means it's not the kind of horror where you ever feel truly scared, there's certainly a tension throughout, and especially where enemies are likely to be lurking. Equally, while the dialogue is all text-based, the vocalizations of emotions like anger and fear add a flavour to them, alongside the text itself occasionally going small to indicate inner thoughts, or literally trembling when emotions run high. And the music is great, the ambience fitting for whatever type of environment we find ourselves in, but the full, bespoke songs for the boss fights really stealing the show. Moving to the gameplay, as we've already explained, there are two distinct types of level: the survival horror levels we progress through to move forward, and the visual novel dating sim stuff in between, where we can explore the community, interact with characters, and affect romantic and friendship arcs. The latter is fairly straightforward, and designed in such a way that you can opt to engage with as much or a little of it as you see fit. Meaning that if it doesn't gel with you, it doesn't impose itself or hold the pacing, but if you're into it, there's lots to do. On the survival horror side, each level is relatively short, taking maybe an hour to beat on average, making this a 5 or 6 hour experience depending on how much you explore, how often you die, etc. There's no map in any of the levels, which would have the potential to be frustrating in larger environments, but the game broadly gets away with it here. In each level there are maybe a couple of doors to open which necessitate exploring to find key items, and the odd puzzle here and there, with more in the final level, but we'll come to that. None of the puzzles are on the level of the Silent Hill piano puzzle or the Resident Evil 3 water puzzle, so you won't find yourself stumped for long, if at all, but they are engaging if fairly straightforward. The most interesting mechanic in these levels is the third eye, which when open presents the environment in a different light. This might allow you to pass through otherwise impassable barriers, or break something which in the other view is unbreakable, as well as feeding into the combat. But you cannot run while the eye is open, and running will close it, which allows the game to present interesting challenges when trying to outrun a pursuit or get by enemies without fighting. Later in the game, you will also use the third eye to move something, whilst also being presented with enemies that only move towards you when the third eye is open, presenting you with a puzzle that combines navigation and combat in a way that can be challenging until you figure it out. Speaking of combat, whenever you choose to fight, aiming your weapon puts you in first-person view, and you cannot move while shooting or swinging your axe. This is where the arcade shooter mechanics come in, coupled with the third eye, because you can just shoot enemies from a distance. Alternatively, you can open your third eye and shoot their weak spots for quicker kills with less ammo. There is, however, a trade-off. When your third eye is open, you cannot damage anything out of its range, and you can only damage their weak spots. For the weakest enemies, this simply means hitting one shot. But for stronger enemies, you must hit a succession of weak spots to kill them, which can be tricky when they're in close quarters and moving to attack you, especially as the aiming and shooting is clunky and it's easy to miss. For me, the clunkiness of the aiming overall fits with the combat system, and that trade-off between more bullets or fewer but with higher risk forces you to think a bit more strategically about combat, and also to get a shot or two before moving to a safe distance and trying again. However, there are a couple of areas where this feels more frustrating than it needs to be. One is in environments where there are either too many enemies or too tight a space to maneuver around, which makes it very easy to get into a space where you're trapped and all you can do is die. The system as it exists works well to disincentivize combat in the traditional survival horror way, and so it feels wrong to do that and then make it impossible to avoid combat in certain areas outside of boss fights, especially as healing items are so rare, which again isn't a bad thing in itself given the gameplay genre. The other area where the clunky shooting can be overly frustrating brings me to the final level, so I'm going to talk about that here. If you don't want to see anything regarding this before you play the game, then skip ahead using the timestamps in the description. There is a specific type of enemy which is a clone of Michelle that runs at you and explodes, causing damage. In itself, this isn't a bad addition and fits thematically with this point in the story. However, in at least one area, you are in an effective maze where they can run at you out of nowhere and are near impossible to avoid or shoot in time, making me very glad to get out of that part of the game. Thankfully, it was only one section. Though while we are talking gameplay spoilers, the puzzles in this final level, where you must open your third eye and control a version of yourself moving in a mirrored direction, reminiscent of a similar puzzle in the original Tomb Raider, were a lot of fun to figure out as the obstacles became more complicated and deadly. Unlike the frustration of the exploding clones, the frustration I felt here was one which spurred me on to work out what I had to do to get past, which I enjoyed a lot. With gameplay spoilers for the last level done, the other shooting mechanic to mention here is a gun called the Heartbreaker, which you charge up by hitting enemy weak spots. You can use it to one-shot kill non-bosses, though the recharge rate means you can't do this often, but it might be useful in a very tight spot. More crucially, it's necessary for the boss fight to deal enough damage with ordinary weapons in order to charge the Heartbreaker to finish it off, and the number of Heartbreaker shots necessary to kill the bosses vary. This makes for some very interesting and varied boss fights using the third eye, your ordinary guns, and the Heartbreaker. In later bosses especially, the tight window to hit ordinary weak spots can cause frustrations, but overall this is a lot of fun once you get the hang of it. You also end up with a shotgun, which is more powerful, requiring you to hit fewer weak spots on an enemy than you would with a pistol. But of course there is less shotgun ammo laying around, so again there is an interesting strategic trade-off happening there. Alongside all of this, there is also a trade and upgrade system which you can use to give yourself an advantage. There are creatures in the levels who will buy items off you in exchange for a currency called Yowzers. There is also a merchant who will buy any collectibles you find in the levels for Yowzers, and you can use those Yowzers in turn to buy upgrades off him. None of these are particularly necessary to play, but can reduce frustrations in some areas, by making health kits more effective, guns do more damage, etc. All of which makes for a surprisingly deep and engaging combat system. Not all of which fits within the survival horror genre, but which nonetheless adds to the fun of the gameplay loop. And that's part of what makes Sorry We're Closed stand out. It uses these elements that absolutely wouldn't work in other survival horror contexts, and uses them to not only enrich the themes of the story and the presentation, but also to carve out its own identity when it comes to the gameplay. And despite the minor frustrations I've outlined, overall it works, and offers up something which is a lot of fun, where the horror doesn't come from outright scares, but from the grisly details when you look past the cynical tongue-in-cheek humour and the colourful queerness of this particular demon underworld. Let me know in the comments if you've played Sorry We're Closed, and if so, what you've thought of it. Or, if you haven't played it yet, whether it's something you're planning on picking up in the near future. If you enjoyed this video, then give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content. Like the video that's just popped up, which YouTube thinks you should watch next. This is a Patreon and member supported channel, so if you want to become a member and unlock custom badges and emojis, early access to my videos, and your name in the credits, then click the join button below. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.